I decided to start this video by reading my own poem about Coleman Barks so that you understand why I'm going to read this essay that was written about Barks. See, here is this essay that I found, The Erasure of Islam from the Poetry of Rumi. And so I'm going to read my poem first. Coleman Barks. Some of the most beautiful poems I've ever read were stripped of truth, lined up for ornamental adornment, painted to disguise nationality or Muslim religion, translated, but he does not know Persian. These folds of mystery I tried to dig my fingers under. I read and reread their murmuring secrets. Maybe you have made them more beautiful, but the face you painted on could have been browner. Why, the most lovely poems I've ever read may just have been lies. So that's a poem that I wrote about Coleman Barks. And here is an article that it was inspired by. The Erasure of Islam from the Poetry of Rumi. A couple of years ago, when Coldplay's Chris Martin was going through a divorce from the actress Gwyneth Paltrow, feeling down, a friend gave him a book to lift his spirits. It was a collection of poetry by Jalaluddin Rumi. Jalaluddin, I don't know how to say it, Rumi, the 13th century Persian poet, translated by Coleman Barks. It kind of changed my life, Martin said later in an interview. The track from Coldplay's most recent album features Barks reciting one of the poems. This human being is a guest house. Every morning a new arrival, a joy, a depression, a meanness. Some momentary awareness comes as an unexpected visitor. Rumi has helped the spiritual journeys of other celebrities, Madonna, Tilda Swinton, some of whom similarly incorporated his works into theirs. Aphorisms attributed to Rumi's circulate daily on social media, offering motivation. If you are irritated by every rub, how will you ever get polished? One of them goes. Or, every moment I shape my destiny with a chisel. I am a carpenter of my own soul. Barks's translation, in particular, are widely shared on the internet, so they are the ones that line American bookstore shelves and are recited at weddings. Rumi is often described as the best-selling poet in the United States. He is typically referred to as a mystic, a saint, a Sufi, and an enlightened man. Curiously, however, although he was a lifelong scholar of the Quran and Islam, he is less frequently described as Muslim. The words that Martin featured on his album come from Rumi's Masavi, a 6-book epic poem that he wrote towards the end of his life. Its 50,000 lines are mostly in Persian, but they are riddled with Arabic excerpts from Muslim scripture, and the book frequently alludes to the Quranic anecdotes that offer moral lessons. The work, which some scholars consider unfinished, has been named the Persian Quran. Fatima Kershavars, and professor of Persian studies at the University of Maryland, told me that Rumi probably had the Quran memorized, given how often he drew from it in his poetry. Rumi himself describes the Masnavi as the roots of the roots of the roots of religion, meaning Islam and the explainer of the Quran, and yet little trace of the religion exists in the translations that we so often sell in the United States. The Rumi that people love is very beautiful in English, and the price you pay is cut to the culture and religion. Jawed Mojadi, a scholar of Sufism at Rutgers, told me recently, Rumi was born in the early 13th century in what is now Afghanistan. He later settled in Konya, a present-day Turkey, with his family. His father was a preacher and a scholar, and he introduced Rumi to Sufism. Rumi continued his theological education in Syria, where he studied more traditional legal codes of Sunni Islam, and later returned to Konya as a seminary teacher. It was there that he met an elder traveler, Shams-I Tabriz, who became his mentor. The nature of the intimate friendship with the two is much debated, but Shams, everyone agrees, had a lasting influence on Rumi's religious practices and his poetry. In a new biography of Rumi, Rumi's Secret, Brad Gooch describes how Sham pushed Rumi to question his scriptural education, debating Quranic passage with him, and emphasizing the idea of devotion, of finding oneness with God. Rumi would come to blend the intuitive love of God, for God, that he found in Sufism with the legal codes of Sunni Islam and the mystical thought he learned from Shams. This unusual tapestry of influences set Rumi apart from many of his contemporaries. Keshavas told me. Still, Rumi built a large following in cosmopolitan Konya, incorporating Sufis, Muslims, literalists, and theologians, Christians and Jews, as well as the local Sunni Seljuk leaders. In Rumi's Secret, Gooch helpfully chronicles the political events and religious educations that influenced Rumi. Rumi was born in a religious family and followed and prescribed rules of daily prayer, fasting through his entire life, Gooch writes. Where am I? Sorry. Where am I? And fasting through his entire life, Gooch writes. Even in Gooch's book, though, there is a tension between these facts and the desire to conclude that Rumi, in some sense, transcends his background, that, as Gooch puts it, he made claim for a religion of love that went beyond all organized faith. What can get lost in such readings is the extent to which Rumi's Muslim teachings shaped even those ideas. As Mujahid notes, the Quran acknowledges Christians and Jews as people of the book, offering as a starting point towards universalism. The universality of many in Rumi's today comes from his Muslim context. The erasure of Islam from Rumi's poetry started long before Coldplay got involved. Ahmed Safi, a professor of Middle Eastern and Islamic studies in Duke University, says that it was in the Victorian period that readers of the West began to uncouple mystical poetry from its Islamic roots. Translators and theologians theologians of the time could not reconcile their ideas as about a desert religion with its unusual moral and legal codes, and the work of poets like Rumi and Hafez. The explanation they settled on, Safi told me, was that the people were mystical not because of Islam, but in spite of it. This is a time when Muslims were singled out for legal discrimination. A law from 1970 curtailed the number of Muslims who come into the United States, and a century later, the U.S. Supreme Court described the intense hostility of people of Muslim faith and other sects, and particularly to Christians. In 1898, the introduction to his translation of the Masnavi, Sir James Redhouse wrote, the Masnavi addresses those who leave the world, try to know and be with God, efface themselves, and devote themselves to spiritual contemplation. For those in the West, Rumi and Islam were separated. In the 20th century, a succession of prominent translators, among them R.A. Nicholson, A.J. Arbery, and Anne-Marie Schimmel, strengthened Rumi's presence in the English language canon, but Barks, who vastly expanded Rumi's readership, He is not a translator so much as an interpreter. He does not read or write Persian. Instead, he transforms 19th century translations into American verse. It's a verse that is particularly kind. Barks was born in 1937, grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee. He received his Ph.D. in English and literature, published his first book of poetry, The Juice, in 1971. The first time he heard of Rumi was later that decade, when another poet, Robert Bly, handed him a copy of translations by Arbery and told him that they had been to release from their cages, that is, put into American free verse. Bly, who had published the poetry in the New Yorker more than 30 years, whose books, Iron John, a book about men from 1990, greatly informed the modern men's movement, later translated some of Rumi's poems himself. Barks never studied Islamic literature, but soon afterwards he told me recently over the phone from his home in Georgia he had a dream. In the dream, he was sleeping on a cliff near a river. A stranger appeared in the circle of light and said, "I love you." Barks had not seen this man before, but he met him the following year after a Sufi near Philadelphia. The man was the order's leader, and Parks began spending his afternoon studying and rephrasing the Victorian translation that Bly had given him. Since then, he published more than a dozen Rumi books. In our conversation, Barks described Rumi's poetry as the mystery of opening the heart, a thing that he told me you can't say in language. In order to get that inexpressible thing, he had taken some liberties with Rumi's works. For something, he had minimized references to Islam. Consider the famous poem Like This by Araby, translated one of its lines rather faithfully as, "Whoever asks you about the Horus, show your face and say like this." Horus are virgins promised to paradise in Islam. Barks avoids even literal translation of the words in his version. The line becomes, "If anyone asks you how the perfect satisfaction of our sexual wanting will look like, lift your face and say like this." The religious context is gone, and yet elsewhere in the same poem, Barks keeps references to Jesus and Joseph. When I asked him about this, he told me he couldn't recall if he made a deliberate choice to remove Islamic references. "I was brought up Presbyterian," he said. "I used to memorize Bible verses, and I know the New Testament more than I know the Quran," he added. "The Quran is hard to read, like many others." Omid Safi credits Barks to introducing Rumi to 1 million readers in the United States and morphing Rumi into American verse. Barks has dedicated considerable time and love to the poet's works and life, and there are other versions of Rumi that are even further removed from the original, such as New Age books by Deepak Chopra and Daniel Lansky, which are marked and sold as Rumi, but bear little resemblance to the poet's writers. Chopra, an author of spiritual works and alternative medicine enthusiast, he admits that his poems are not Rumi's words. Rather, he writes an introduction to the love poems of Rumi. They are moods we have captured, and certain phrases radiated from the original Farsi, given life to a new creation, but retaining the essence of the source. Discussing these New Age translations, Safi said, "I see a type of spiritual colonialism at work here, bypassing, erasing, and occupying the spiritual landscape that has been lived and breathed and internalized by Muslims and from Bosnia to Istanbul to Konya and Iran and Central and South Asia, extracting the spiritual from the religious context are deep reverberations. Islam is regularly diagnosed as a cancer, including by General Michael Flynn, President-elect Donald Trump's pick for National Security Advisor. And even today, policymakers suggest that non-Western and non-white groups have not contributed to civilization. For his part, Barks sees religion as secondary to the essence of Rumi. Religion such as a point of contention for the world, he told me. "I got my truth, and you got your truth. This is just absurd. We're all in this together. I'm trying to open my heart to Rumi, and Rumi's poetry helps me." One might detect in his philosophy something of Rumi's own approach to poetry. Rumi often amends texts from the Quran so that they would fit the lyrical rhyme of the meter of the Persian verse. But while Rumi's Persian readers would recognize the tactic, most American readers are unaware of the Islamic blueprint. Safi had compared reading Rumi without the Quran to reading Milton without the Bible. Even if Rumi is heterodox, it's important to recognize that he was heterodox in a Muslim context, and that Islamic culture centuries ago had from for such a heterodoxy. Rumi's words are not just layered of religion, they represent a historical dynamism with Islamic scholarship. Rumi used the Quran, hadiths, and religion in an explorative way, often challenging conventional readings. One of Barks's popular renditions goes like this: "Out beyond the ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there is a field. I'll meet you there." The original verse makes no mention of wrongdoing or right doing. The words Rumi wrote were iman, religion, and kufr, infidelity. Imagine then a Muslim scholar saying that the basis of faith lies not in religious code, but in the elevated space of compassion and love. What we and perhaps many Muslim clerics might radiate today is an interpretation of Rumi that puts forward more than several hundred years ago. Such readings are not entirely unique back then. Rumi's words reflected a broader push and pull between religious spirituality and internalized faith, though with a wit that was unmatched. Historically speaking, no text has shaped the imagination of Muslims other than the Quran and as the poetry of Rumi and Hafiz. Safi said, "That is why Rumi's voluminous writings, produced at a time when scribes had to copy works by hand, had survived. Language isn't meant just as a means of communication," the writer and translator Sinan Antun said. "It's a reservoir of memory, tradition, and heritage. As conduits between two cultures, translators take on inherently political project. They must figure how to make, for instance, a 13th century Persian poet comprehensible as a contemporary American audience, but they have a responsibility to remain true to the original work, that an act that, in the case of Rumi, he would help readers to recognize the professor of Sharia, who would also write some of the world's most read loved poems. Jawed Mojadi is now in the midst of year-long project to translate all 6 works of the Masnavi. 3 of them have been published. The 4th is due out in spring. His translations of the Islamic and Quranic texts of the original by using italics and denotes whether Rumi switches to Arabic. His books are also riddled with footnotes. Reading them requires some effort and perhaps a desire to see beyond one's own perceptions. That, after all, is the main point of translation: to understand the foreign. As Kursvars put it, translation is a reminder that everything has a form, everything has culture and history. A Muslim can be like that too. So this was written by Rosina Ali in the New Yorker, and it really made me think a lot about things, and it made me kind of unsure of my thoughts on Coleman Barks, because I have always loved those poems so much that he writes about, well, from Rumi, but I didn't realize how whitewashed it was and how it was omitting the truth about Islam being so central to it. I even, at one point, I'm trying to find it in one of my emails, I wrote Coleman Barks one time, and I'm trying to find, because he did write me back. I'm not quite sure which one of my... I know that he's a really great poet, for sure. He was a wonderful poet, but this is the same thing I just sent, so no, I don't know where it is. But yeah, I mean, he's a wonderful poet, but we need to read Muslim translations of Rumi, basically, is the great takeaway from all this. So read some Muslim translations of Rumi.